It's that time of the year again when we pull up our favorite slasher flicks from a spooky season marathon. Yep, we've all seen Scream or Friday the 13th, but among these lies an underrated gem that just isn't talked about well enough. So, in this Marvellous video, we're going to do just that. So get ready to dive into a world where your worst fears are forced back to life, all under the ruse of an academic study. Let's discuss the movie adapted from Clive Barker's wicked story, Dread. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means an awful lot. Thank you, and let's begin. An introduction to Dread. Dread was a psychological horror film which came out in 2009. Written and directed by Anthony Di Blasi, Dread was actually a film adaptation of a short story by the same name. The Books of Blood by Clive Barker was a 6-part anthology that was published in 1984. His success was even predicted by none other than Stephen King, who claimed he had seen the future of horror, and its name was Clive Barker. Today, Barker is best known for his Hellraiser franchise, based on his Hellbound Heart novella, which gave birth to one of the most iconic characters in horror history, good old Pinhead. But back to the Books of Blood. Among the stories titled The Midnight Meat Train and Pig Blood Blues, Barker wrote Dread. Up till this point, Barker had explicitly mentioned that he didn't write Psycho on the loose stories. Most of his horror tales had a supernatural element to them, something which removed these stories from our logical reality. Well, all except for Dread. You see, in Volume 2 of the Books of Blood, Dread was a story of human depravity, the lengths one could go to so that they could quieten the voices in their head. Dread had no supernatural elements, but simply the worst of the human mind. The plot of Dread. The film began with a philosophy lecture which spoke about Cyrenaic hedonism, which prioritized instant gratification of one's own needs at the expense of other people, regardless of their pain. It seemed as though this movie's main villain took this and ran with it till the very end. As for the good guy, Stephen Grace, a film major, first met Quaid right when they stepped out for a smoke. Quaid was an odd fellow, a philosophy student who mainly painted naked women as a hobby, one that would be revealed later on. Quaid expressed his interest in studying the philosophy of fear and, more importantly, dread. Quaid, although crass in his own way, had the uncanny ability to open people up, making them reveal their worst nightmares and anticipated fears. It turned out that Stephen's older brother had been driving while drunk, and the two crashed. Stephen survived while his brother didn't. His survivor's guilt forced him to question whether his brother would have survived if he had driven instead. Quaid suggested that they do a never-seen-before study of fear, which would also work as Stephen's thesis project, so they enlisted the help of Cheryl, a film editor, and a fellow student, so the trio set to work. Quaid found the first group of people they interviewed to be absolutely laughable, since they spoke about their fear of spiders, heights, and clowns. Not to say that phobias cannot instill sheer terror in someone, but it just wasn't what Quaid was looking for. He hinted at his madness when he smashed Stephen's watch, after which Cheryl quickly stepped in and offered to be interviewed to pacify Quaid. See? This man always found a way to get what he truly wanted. Cheryl sat in front of the camera and opened up about the horror abuse she was put through by her father during her childhood. Her father worked at a meat-packing plant slaughtering cattle during the day while doing unspeakable things at night. The smell of meat repelled her, which was why she was vegetarian. Now it was Quaid's turn to share what haunted him, but he refused. That night, we got a glimpse of his nightmare, an axe his parents lay dead. It turned out that when Quaid was just 6 years old, a madman broke into their house and axed down both his parents. He then approached little Quaid toying with his axe, telling the child that all that remained of his parents was the blood on his axe. Stephen wondered what made Quaid wake up screaming bloody murder. The next day, the trio resumed their study by interviewing a boy named Joshua, who had been in an accident and lost his hearing for 3 years of his life. His biggest fear was going deaf again. In the book, it was Stephen who had lost his hearing, but the film changed it up a bit for the better. Next, Abby, who was Stephen's coworker, asked to be interviewed by him alone. She revealed how her birthmark was a constant reminder of how she was different from others, especially her beautiful sisters. She then stripped in front of the camera, and Stephen revealing her birthmark, which began to the right side of her face, all the way down to her right foot. She then tried to kiss Stephen, who had been kind to her all this while but didn't feel romantically attracted to her since his heart lay with Cheryl. Abby assumed Stephen did not find her attractive for her birthmark. She found false solace in Quaid instead, who took advantage of her vulnerable state. Abby asked to be painted by Quaid but without her birthmark, which he did. The next woman they interviewed was violently attacked by Quaid, who lost it when he realized she was lying about her trauma. He continued raging, destroying the video camera and all of Cheryl's video equipment. Later on, a frightened Cheryl tried to salvage some of the tapes when she stumbled across Quaid's paintings of women. They were nude portraits, but their bodies were painted with slashed mutilations. She was confronted by Quaid with a manic gleam in his eye, insisting that he wanted to take the fear study to the next level.
No.
The characters in Dredd. Now, before we jump right into how this torture flick ended, let's talk about the essence of the movie and its characters. There were no jump scares or incompetent characters walking straight to their deaths a second after the audience predicted it. More importantly, the psycho on the loose, dare we say, was a philosophy student named Quaid, played by Sean Evans. The whole spiral of horror kick-started when Quaid wished to study the philosophy of fear. Closely examine what fear does to us and how the beast will catch up to its prey eventually. He suggested the fear study, which was just his way of working through his own complex trauma in the worst way imaginable. Right off the bat, you can observe a sinister underlayer to Quaid's character, who was, in fact, a deeply disturbed character, one whose first impressions of the world were grisly. When Quaid was just a little 6-year-old boy, scarred and defenseless, he was forced to watch his parents get brutally murdered by a madman. The film never revealed who his parents' killer really was because it didn't matter. By the end, Quaid had become just like the madman who killed his parents. He became the very thing that he wished to flee from. Quaid began by befriending Stephen, quickly getting to know what his deepest fear was. After this, Cheryl opens up about her darkest secret, but Quaid still refuses to share his side of the story. He wished to remain invulnerable amongst his friends, instead choosing to use them as a means for his own catharsis at the cost of their sanity. All in all, Quaid was extremely misguided, if not downright delusional, to think his horrible attempts at therapy were actually helping. The question remains, did he still believe in facing the beast even when 2 people lay dead in his house? Stephen Grace, played by Jackson Rathbone, also played Jasper with his piercing gaze in Twilight. Stephen was portrayed as a reserved, shy guy, was kind to the few people he spoke to. Stephen's first impression of Quaid told us that he found the guy a bit brash and rough around the edges, but his uncut honesty encouraged Stephen to be vulnerable and open up about his older brother's death. This was the trauma that Quaid chose to prey on. While Quaid seemed like the classically psycho antagonist who was conditioned by his earlier experiences to lash out and hurt everything in sight, Stephen, on the other hand, was a force of good and kindness in the face of evil. He shyly opened his heart to Cheryl, and the two shared a sweet, albeit very short time together. Even though he wasn't romantically drawn to Abby, he still greatly cared for her as a friend. Not to mention, he tried his best to remain professionally empathetic during the fear study, unlike Quaid, who grew increasingly frustrated. It's fair to say he did not deserve to be axed. Cheryl, played by Hans Steen, was a tragic example of how parents could choose to make or break their children's lives. As we mentioned, Quaid grew increasingly frustrated by the fear study, which led Cheryl to open up about her honest-to-God trauma, as per Quaid. At first glance, Cheryl's childhood seemed normal. Her mom worked at the local supermarket, while her father worked at a remote meat packing plant where he would slaughter cattle so the residents of the town could indulge in corn-fed organic beef. By the time her father returned home from a grueling day of work, Cheryl's mom would be asleep. She confessed that her father reeked of the metallic smell of the blood from all the cattle he slaughtered. In a horrifying moment, Cheryl opened up about how her father abused her every single night, while the stink of his flesh was all she remembered. Obviously, this stayed with her, and her decision to open up about her worst experiences was in turn abused by Quaid further when he held her hostage. Unfortunately, Cheryl was never given a fair chance to heal. She was pushed down this spiral, which she had spent years trying to climb out of. Moving on, how could anyone get rid of a part of themselves that they were born with? Abby, played by Laura Donnelly, sought out the answers, which nearly ended with her dying. Abby was shown to be a sweet, amiable girl who worked with Stephen at their local bookstore. One thing that set Abby apart from the others was her unique birthmark, which covered the right side of her whole body. She was clearly conscious of the way she looked, even though her smile lit up the whole room. Right from the beginning, she had a little crush on Stephen, who didn't pick up on this and did not reciprocate these feelings. The predator struck again, playing with Abby's vulnerabilities surrounding her birthmark. Quaid led her to believe he found her uniquely attractive, yet never touched any of her marked skin. His actions landed the poor girl straight in the emergency room. Though she survived what she inflicted on herself, could Abby's psyche recover after all that had happened?
Your father.
Ending explained. Now, by claiming he wished to upgrade her fear study, Quaid meant he wanted to recreate people's worst fears. He began by asking for Steven's forgiveness and offering him a ride home. Quaid was drunk as he mimicked the way Steven's older brother presumably drove moments before he was killed. With Abby on his list next, he projected a video of her stripping to all the channels across campus. This proved to be her last straw. Abby proceeded to bathe herself in bleach while scrubbing away her birthmark with steel wool. Thankfully, Steven found her covered in her own blood and rushed her to the ER. It was revealed that Quaid had kidnapped Joshua, the kid who was terrified of going deaf again. Under the pretense of asking him more questions for the study, Quaid knocked him out and trapped him in what was essentially a torture device. Joshua woke to find his ears covered by 2 cups, which simulated the time he spent when he was deaf. Now, this was when things really took a turn. Quaid went a step further and fired his gun right next to Joshua's ears, which painfully deafened him. This was as twisted as it got, but apparently not. By this point, Steven was at the end of his teaser. He took one look at Abby and decided he would make Quaid pay for what he did with an axe in hand. Steven broke into Quaid's home, recreating the terrifying moments of his childhood. But Quaid managed to overcome his fear in a way by overpowering an axe-wielding Steven. Quaid then revealed his ultimate torture. The way he took the fear study to the next level was by holding Cheryl hostage in a tiny room with the windows boarded up. She had a bucket and a well-cooked steak on a plate. Quaid wanted to observe how long it would take before Cheryl's spirit finally broke to the point where she would eat the meat. In a heartbreaking sequence of scenes, one could see Cheryl slowly lose her mind as she remained trapped in the one thing that reminded her of the worst things she had been through. The room was warm and the steak began to rot, but after a week of no food, Cheryl broke and ate the maggot-ridden meat. While Steven watched this tape with a sinking heart, Joshua had broken into Quaid's house. The deafened kid wielded the same axe and, in a maniacal frenzy, attacked the wrong guy. Steven fell with an axe rammed into his chest, just as Quaid shot Joshua. As the psycho killer leaned over a dying Steven, he saw the light seep out of his eyes. Steven had finally experienced what his brother did moments before he died. If it could get any more depraved, Quaid dragged Steven's corpse to where Cheryl was trapped. He tossed her a knife and questioned just how hungry she would get to want to eat her ex-lover. Clive Barker's most famous works included supernatural tales of the Candyman or Pinhead, but Dread was a simple reminder of how humans can be far more terrifying than any demon. Not to be too dramatic, but also staying in the spirit of this movie, Dread showed us how unchecked human desire can lead to calamity. Quaid saw his fellow students or friends, as he called them, as nothing more than guinea pigs. Dread can be considered a true psychological horror as it tugged on its audience's empathy, especially in the moments when innocent people were relentlessly tortured, all for Quaid to untangle his mind's tangled mess. Dread didn't just show us mindless body horror, it made its viewers question how a human could enact such cruelty under the pretense of helping others. While Dread will always remain an underrated masterpiece as a Clive Barker adaptation, it has been criticized for glorifying torture and its edgy dialogue, which is undoubtedly a product of its own time. Marvellous verdict. Clive Barker's Dread reminded us that while fear is a natural protective mechanism instilled in everyone, it can also lead someone to the darkest corners of their mind, those they might not be willing to face, instead choosing to hurt others rather than facing their own fear. That being said, it's time to climb out of this hellhole. Do you think psychological thrillers such as this one work better in the horror genre as compared to the classic demon exorcism shtick? Let us know down below. As always, if you like the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.